we're going to be talking today about the research project that I'm involved in. This is the EDC-7 Pilot Evaluation of Strategic Workforce Development for Justice Challenged Youth. EDC standing for Every Day Counts. That's through the Federal Highway Administration. And I'll just tell a little bit before we get into the slides about my program, what brings me to this table. At Rutgers, I'm under the Center for Advanced Infrastructure and Transportation. My unit is the Employment Success Program, and we run programs throughout the state in 8 counties, working with justice-impacted individuals. We started with justice-impacted youth, which was what brought us to this research. Most of our work is implementation work, but we found that a combination of implementation and research actually helps to support the work, helps to strengthen us in our efforts to advocate and change systems. So that's really been our major thing. Most of our other projects are funded by the New Jersey Department of Labor, and we do workplace readiness for justice impacted youth and now also adults. We've done pre-apprenticeships in heavy equipment and auto tech. We've served about 400 individuals. We call them participants over this past year alone, many more than that over the past several years, and grown my staff from just 2.5, 3 years ago to now we have 13 of us. So we've definitely been strengthened by this work and this partnership and parenting by the Center for Advanced Infrastructure and Transportation involvement in this infrastructure world. So we're thrilled about this work, and we can go on to the next slide. I think there's a couple of just introductory slides, the partners that we're so grateful for. This is the co-PIs with my boss, Pat Zari, Kieran Bellum from Texas A&M, and myself. So I've been kind of in charge of the work, and this is the work. So who we're working with, who we are looking for. Basically, this project is to gather and assess programs throughout the country that are doing similar work to ours, that are working with young people aged 16 to 26 impacted by the justice system, coming from historically marginalized communities. We're talking to and interviewing programs that are working with the challenges of poverty, lack of education or engagement, unsupervised out of school time. These are all the challenges that folks are working with. We're basically doing a assessment, or not even really an assessment. We're collecting data about programs across the country that are doing this workplace readiness work, and with this population that I'm describing up here. The photos that you see in the presentation are all photos from our actual program. So this was a safety course in OSHA training for our auto tech program. One of the things also is we do a blend of justice impacted individuals, but also individuals that may not be impacted by the justice system, but still are vulnerable. We kind of include both in our projects, many of our projects. Some are identified by the justice impact. Some have a history of justice impact. Some aren't impacted by justice directly, but have it in the family or in the community around them. So that's kind of the work that we do. We that immersion is important to us. I only say these things so you understand, like the format of who we are as we're talking to folks is really kind of important behind the scenes. And then the programs have their own agendas. We're trying to get the breakdown of who's doing what and where, looking for, and we'll get into more in the other slides, but we'll talk about that. But the other part of the who is, I'm sorry, I missed the last thing there. We'll go on to support of education, job opportunities, that reduces recidivism and generates hope and positive community interaction. It's why we exist as a program and really how we identify the programs to speak to. Okay, next slide, sorry. Thank you. Why? Because with caring functional supports, youth and emerging adults demonstrate growth and success. So for us, it's case management that's the baseline for that. But we find that what we're finding as we talk to folks is that there's different methodologies and different ways to engage. But as long as there's something for them to latch onto, they tend to do better. Programs that focus on the population vary, as I was just saying, in approach and style, funding, and resources, which is also important. That was one of the things we added to the questionnaires, was finding out how programs are funded. That was something that we realized we needed to know. Intervention strategies and programs are localized, mostly regional, and they're reflective of the communities served. And we want to construct, we are in the process of constructing a comprehensive as can be, database of these programs that lists the strengths, the techniques, the challenges, and also, as I just said, some of the funding and resources that help them run. Next slide. How? So, we learned as we went that we had to kind of even modify somewhat as the research progressed. But we started out thinking we were just going to kind of focus on infrastructure-based and transportation-based programs. And what we realized is that a lot of folks don't necessarily identify. They don't necessarily understand that infrastructure is so all-encompassing, and they could be running a carpentry program and not realize that's called infrastructure. So we had to kind of back off of that a little bit and explore all the workplace prep programs for justice impacted youth, and even look at the ones that are working with adults, because often there's crossover in terms of age. So some programs work with 18 and plus. They don't call it a youth-based program, but we're talking about youth 16 to age 26, which is typical the age gap for or age range, I should say, for the DOL sponsored programs. We wanted to determine major funding supports for the programs. Like for us, it's DOL. Other places have Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice, Office of Minority Health was a program that was a state federal agency, that actually funded a previous research project of ours studying case management modalities. So there's a lot of different funding supports, and some of it's regionalized, some of it's national, some of it's state, and we wanted to kind of know. We want to create a list, and we are creating a list of currently or recently funded programs that include the demographics about those programs, specifics and details. We wanted to start with our local programs in state, because these are folks that we're partnered with and that we know. We've already contacted and arranged interviews and started the interview process with folks, and then we wanted to use our staff, which includes formerly incarcerated credible messengers on our staff hired by the State University of Rutgers to contact programs and conduct the interviews. We thought we might be able to expand beyond that, but we really found that you kind of need to be knowledgeable of the system and knowledgeable about the work to really have a good, robust interview. It can't just be someone reading from the interview questions. Speaking of questions, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll leave some time at the end. I hope to answer those questions if there are any. Next slide. And I don't even know when I started, so I'm kind of pacing myself to go quick, but only because I thought I only had 5 minutes left, but we might have started late, so I'll just keep rolling. The what? So far we've identified 70 plus youth and young adult programs across 22 states. We gathered their contact information. We were able to explore the programs. We got lists of the programs based on finding who was funded from some of those big organizations, and basically went from there. So USDOL, it does a lot of funding for programs like this, so that they have a comprehensive list of a lot of these programs. And then we knew some local programs. When we talked to one person, we find out about 5 other programs. So it's this kind of thing. I'm sure there's way more than 70, but we've at least identified 70, and we're starting with that group. We reached out to our local programs first, as I said, and we're expanding to other regions. So we have talked to folks down in Baltimore that run a national program, and some of the state programs in New Jersey also have national footprints. Interviewer has to be this knowledgeable systems person, as I said. We wanted to maintain research integrity, so we have a standardized set of interview questions that have been approved by the IRB, but also allows for some dialogue during the interviews. It has to be a natural flowing interview with between two knowledgeable folks about the system to really kind of get to the depth of the information. It can't just be ask a question, get a one sentence answer. You're really trying to dig a little deeper and find out about the philosophy and what's behind the scenes and how they and the challenges and the struggles. And you only do that by actually having a real conversation. And then we also added in the funding sources. We hadn't included that in the original interview questionnaire, but we want to know if folks are willing to share what their funding sources are, how they keep their programs going. We recorded the interviews, and then we used AI resources for transcripts. All the interviews have been virtual and will continue to be virtual because otherwise we'd run out of our budget very quick if we were trying to run all over the country. As fun as that might be to go meet other folks on their turf. Next slide. So the interviews. So this gentleman happens to be one of the folks we interviewed. The shirt, I couldn't get a good picture of him with the full shirt. It says productive felon. So this is a gentleman that runs a program here in New Jersey who happens to also have been formerly incarcerated and got his college degree while incarcerated, came out and wants to really help out communities, runs a workplace readiness program. So we met with 5 programs so far using the Zoom platform. The interviews lasted up to about an hour and a half. And the programs that we talked to include Recode Your Future, Street Law, Community Progress and Restoration, Make It Work, Neighborhood Redevelopment and Cooperative Solutions. And like I said, some of them are run by formerly incarcerated individuals. We feel that this connectivity to formerly incarcerated individuals, those that have been impacted by the justice system, what folks call credible messengers, is critical to the work. It's crucial to really being able to work with the population that can be oftentimes resistant. The system has oftentimes failed them. They're dealing with policies and structure in the community that sometimes targets them based on race or other factors. And we do a lot of advocacy, and the programs that we speak to, what we're finding does a lot of advocacy as well. So the common factors of the program so far include community immersion, really important. You got to be in and of the community. It's got to be localized. You have to, even if it's a national program, each place that folks are has to really reflect the community. Mentorship is critical. Like I just talked about, credible messengers. It doesn't have to be all credible messengers that offer the mentorship and support, but it has to be a component of it. And making a safe space for learning, because oftentimes folks in the communities that we work with and other folks work with are scared. They're scared sometimes to go from one area, one neighborhood to another neighborhood to go to a program. So offering hybrid models, offering to provide transportation, these are all important things. The lessons that we learned is that job attainment has to be top priority when we're talking about workplace readiness, that longevity and follow-up is important. That you run a 3-month program and you're going to miss out on the opportunity to really develop a relationship. There are always funding concerns. Everybody is seeking funding, and it's become more and more competitive. And then longevity is, as I said already, is and the tracking of it is essential. When I say it the second time, is because I think about after the actual program is over, tracking and checking back with folks, making sure that people are keeping the jobs that they get. Next slide. So there are some themes that started to emerge in the conversation we've had already, and even the programs that we've found, that individualized attention and planning is critical and crucial, that the supports have to culturally reflect the participants. In other words, when we're in like where we are in Camden, large population of Black, African-American folks and Hispanic folks, so that Latinx folks. And so we hired staff that reflect that. And we make sure that it's folks that are familiar and understand the community that we're serving and the neighborhoods that we're serving as well. That the credentials have to be job opportunity specific. Useless credentials don't matter. So while they can hit a benchmark to get somebody a credential, unless there's a job attached to it, what we found is, especially with the population we serve, it doesn't really hold any water for them. And that infrastructure and transportation can't really be isn't necessarily the focus, although, like I said before, it sometimes is the result in that folks get into those opportunities based upon their areas of interest. A lot of folks we serve say they want to work with their hands, so it makes sense for us to move them into infrastructure related jobs, and transportation is a no-brainer. And that the trainings vary depending on the location and the available jobs and careers. You can't just standardize, what you're looking for or the kind of trainings. They have to be very specific to, especially the locale in the country and even in the states. Where you're located matters. Rural areas are going to have different jobs available than urban areas. And that successes are pretty much defined the same. It includes job attainment and retention. Retention really, really is the important piece. Not just getting a job, also keeping it for, let's say, 12 months. Really an important piece of this. And that a job, we say job, but we really differentiate between job and career. And we talk a lot about searching for career, which requires education and requires some training and learning on the job, and has some capacity to create a sustainable income. And then reduction in justice involvement, really crucial. We want to make sure that they're getting out of or staying out of the path of justice involvement. Next slide. And some of the challenges. We had some programs that refused to give us an interview, felt that their information was proprietary and didn't necessarily want to share it on a public national forum. Some were just unresponsive and just, I guess folks are busy just doing the work. Some thought because we said infrastructure and transportation that they didn't count because they weren't necessarily focused on that, even if they were doing stuff that, if I explained to them, was infrastructure related, they still took it as an opportunity to kind of not want to get interviewed. For us, our Kate staff, the folks that we have working on our projects, are pretty busy conducting our own program activities. So we don't have a lot of folks really available to conduct the interviews and do the research. So we've kind of had to target it and target times of slower times to kind of do it and this kind of thing. So we've had to pace ourselves. Programs identify funding sources as a challenge, competition for limited money. And then it's tough to identify, as I said, infrastructure and transportation specific programs. So we cast that wider net and then kind of figured out. We also get an opportunity to talk to folks about infrastructure and transportation as job opportunities as we speak to folks. And then language barriers. We want to make sure that we're dealing with Spanish-speaking populations. Oftentimes, the young people we work with speak both English and Spanish, but their families don't speak anything but Spanish. So we make sure we have Spanish speakers on our staff. Also, other programs have said the same. And that capacity building among employers is very little, if any, funding to do that, to really build up the employment side of things and talk to employers and get them to understand the strength and power of hiring folks with justice impact. And then sometimes unsupportive systems can be a challenge, as indicated by some of the interviews. Transportation, childcare, general advocacy and systems advocacy and legal advocacy, wraparound. These are really important factors and challenges that sometimes aren't addressed as easily. And what I've seen is lately that there's some more funding towards that, and other programs are also using wraparound as a model. Strengths-based, trauma-informed, those are important things, counting on including mental and physical health care as a piece of the preparation for careers. Next slide. All right, I guess that was it in terms of our program. We're working together with NCIT and the other UTCs, and we're just proud and honored to be part of all this. It's the way it all works. Next slide. I think these are just the final slides. Yeah, we talk about our essential partnerships. And I think that's it. This next slide is the questions. Yeah. So this is a kid, Anderson, one of our earliest participants from, I'd say, probably 10 years ago. He was an interesting character. So I wanted to kind of include him because he's kind of not really a mascot, but when I think of our program and the success of our program, this young man came in really with some challenges, mental health challenges. We gave him some baseline supports. He came in, he worked on resumes, he worked on his plan. He became a professional boxer at one point. And it's just, you just don't know. You don't know that if you are the resource and the refuge, how things are going to go. And we're honored to talk to folks across the country about this effort. Are there any questions? Do I have to look in the chat myself, or?
Just wanted to give you a round of applause and thank you for your presentation,
Thank
Todd.
you.
Are there any questions for Todd? You could either drop your questions into the chat or into the Q&A option.
I see one about employers starting to be more positive in hiring the individuals. I'd say that the interesting part of that is that the employers that say that they're second chance employers, oftentimes, while they philosophically have that kind of tag, they become ultra competitive because they've tagged themselves that way. So everybody's trying to get a piece of them. So what we've done is we've engaged employers that haven't necessarily identified themselves in that way. And we're finding this from the other programs as well. So really, I would say yes, but only because of advocacy and effort and also success. So once you place somebody, once they've been vetted and trained and really coached, and you stay coaching them while they're employed, that kind of shows and demonstrates to employers the value of hiring somebody with a background. And if someone's currently involved, what we're finding, even speaking with the other programs, if someone's currently involved in the justice system, they come with a probation officer, maybe court dates, they've got eyes on them. So they're sometimes even a better employee than me or you, honestly. Because I'm not saying we might have folks in the room that might have had a justice impact, but what I know is that folks really, really want to work. They need to work. They're being pressured to work by systems. So this is part of our advocacy with employers. Thank you. That was a good question. Any others?
I think we have one from Gabby Kodolci. She's asking, your database could be very helpful for our organization. When will that be launched, and will that be publicly available?
Oh yeah, the intention is for us to build this database with the information, with the strengths, with the challenges. I'd say within the next 6 months, and make it available. Absolutely, we intend to publish this. We intend to have this as a tool. I mean, that's the purpose of this research is the collaboration and sharing. So yes.
That's great news. And just to let you know, Todd, Gabrielle is with TTI with the Youth Transportation Safety Program. So this would be very viable for her group.
Awesome. I'd love to stay in touch after today. So my information is up on the screen. Please feel free to call me. That's my cell, talk or text. And then my email address is up there. And honored to speak to you folks today. Thank you so much for the time. Did I go over, or was I okay in time?
I think you're perfect with time. With that, we are going to go ahead and transition over to Jacqueline Kuzio. And at the end, if there is still time allotted, we could always come back to you, Todd, for any further questions. So if you do think of any questions, just put your questions either into the chat or to the Q&A section, and then we can come back to questions at the end. And just for some transparency in time frame, we are looking to end the concurrent sessions around 10:45. So Jackie, I think that should give you enough time to go over your presentation and maybe have still some Q&A at the end.
Perfect. Thank you, Steph. Okay. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see my presentation. So you're going to be hearing from me twice today. So the PI on this project is Brianne Glover, but my name is Jacqueline Kuzio. I was a research team member on this. Brianne sadly cannot be with us today, but this project specifically is looking at EV infrastructure and their impacts on transportation revenues. And so with that, we're actually thinking of in terms of kind of overall, as we see an increase in both EV charging infrastructure and EV adoption, what does that do to state transportation revenues, which we know are often kind of fuel tax based? And so throughout this research, we're going to be kind of assessing what that decline is, and then looking for, what are your revenue options, the options to address that loss. And alongside that, we are looking at kind of some of those environmental cost savings as well, which I think is a big piece of when we're thinking of electric vehicles, kind of having that as part of your policy conversation when you're thinking in terms of revenue options as well. And so a big part of obviously Insight and most of the UTCs is technology transfer. And so the output of this research will be a sketch planning tool for policymakers and planners that, as I mentioned, kind of looks at the shortfalls in transportation funding from our traditional mechanisms and helps to identify some of those new revenue streams. And the tool will be made available through the Insight Data Hub as well. And so just kind of a quick overview of where we're at with the project. So we started with kind of our literature review and state of the practice, and I'll kind of talk about how that informed the tool in a second. And right now we're kind of in the final stages of developing that sketch planning tool. And then after that, we're kind of, in that process at the moment as well of applying that tool to different scenarios. And again, this is all really to help the user in kind of applying this tool and developing kind of their policy option or what their potential revenue option is, and kind of starting that conversation with some of their policymakers. And so, as I mentioned, we did that state of the practice review, and kind of this really helped inform kind of how we were going to develop the tool. So, um, we did not include all 50 states in the tool. What we've done is try to capture 15 that kind of represent different, geographic locations in the US, but also different population levels, EV adoption rates, as well as the amount of charging infrastructure that they have. And so you often hear when we're talking about EVs and EV charging, like the chicken and the egg conversation, in terms of what do we need first? Do we need that charging infrastructure to have people feel comfortable in switching to an EV? Or is it that as we adopt EVs, kind of that charging infrastructure will come just to support those vehicles? And so we did want to take that into account and take a look at kind of how states are faring in terms of, EVs as a percentage of their population, but also in terms of kind of the number of EVs they have as well in the state registered. And what is kind of interesting in some senses, you'll see some of our low population states maybe have like kind of a high number of charges per capita. And that's, I think, because we're seeing, they're maybe earlier in the adoption of trying to push out some of that EV charging infrastructure to enable their adoption. And so they don't have kind of a high number of EVs registered in the state, but they do have kind of that charging infrastructure piece. And the final thing that we looked at in terms of our state of the practice was those revenue options to address the revenue shortfall that we're expecting from the fuel tax revenues. And so a lot of states are starting to try and address this, mostly through registration fees, but we are also looking at states that have kind of addressed a road user charge program like Oregon, or a per kilowatt hour fee is another option that I think has been enacted in Ohio. And so kind of jumping onto the planning tool. And so obviously, as I mentioned, those states kind of form the baseline. And while it is not, representative of all 50 states, we're hoping that provides a good sample for people to see, okay, this state is kind of has a similar trend to me, and I can use that as a baseline. And ultimately, it is based on kind of EV ownership and what we see as some of the growth projections. And so, in developing these 5-year growth projections, we use kind of a mixture of state level data. So, obviously, we've seen kind of an increase in kind of research and planning around this as we have, increased funding for the bipartisan infrastructure law, not just in terms of, rebates and incentives for buying electric vehicles, but obviously NEVI is kind of a huge program that's providing money for charging infrastructure for those states. And so some states have started to develop their own projections to help them with some of these charging infrastructure decisions. And we did take that into account when we were kind of putting together these growth scenarios as well. I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the user inputs on the next slide, as well as the outputs. But essentially, the output is kind of that the kind of current level of fuel tax revenue, as well as the expected loss due to the increase in electric vehicles, and then how we can kind of start applying different revenue sources to address that gap. And so, as I mentioned, I'm kind of going to give a little bit more detail in terms of what the user can select, as well as kind of what the overall outputs are. And so the first selection is that state, and that kind of feeds into some of the other factors, especially when we're thinking of the state energy mix. And so that plays into the output that is the environmental cost savings. And again, with this, while it's not necessarily something that you can talk about in terms of revenue, again, I think it's kind of part of this broader policy conversation of how we want to craft our transportation revenue sources moving forward. And so we see different states have different goals in terms of this. And so if there is some environmental goals attached to, your transportation system, I think kind of having, you might want to structure your revenue recovery from EVs slightly differently than if you're just trying to kind of recover what will be lost from the fuel tax. And then the next thing is the growth scenarios. So we are offering a range of different scenarios in terms of that EV adoption growth. So we're basing that on, current adoption of EVs as well as population, and then that access to charging, because we know that those kind of go hand in hand. But that allows kind of for, again, that scenario sketch planning of, okay, so right now we're seeing this level of growth, but kind of we expect an uptick. So kind of what would that look like in maybe more of a fast or high growth scenario? And then you can also select whether you have an EV fee already. So if you already have a registration fee, that will be pre-populated. But say, you're using this a year from now and you've just increased it, you would be able to go in and edit, and that would show you kind of what that change would be. And then finally, we're offering kind of the potential revenue options. And so, as I mentioned, EV registration fee is kind of a very common option right now, but road user charge is also something that not even just at the state level, but also at the federal level, we're kind of starting to take a look at, because while this research is very much focused on EVs, the concern over transportation revenues is realistically not just focused on EVs. We see an increase in fuel efficiency, and that's kind of ultimately leading to an increased shortfall as well. And so, while EVs do exacerbate that because they're not contributing at all through the fuel tax revenue, um, again, it's kind of part of a broader conversation that we have to be having about how we fund our transportation system. And then kind of switching over to what the outputs will be. So you'll be provided with the current fuel tax revenues, and then what that change would likely be based on the growth scenario that you've picked. And we add in the current EV revenue collected, by whatever method that might be, and then provide the gap. And then through that kind of gap, you can start assessing, those potential revenue streams and what you need to do in order to, either just recover what you might be losing in the future, or if you know that that's actually really not supporting your goals, kind of what do you maybe need to do to start increasing revenue, and that would be something maybe not just EV related, but across the whole system as well. And so that kind of wraps up kind of how the tool will look, but we also are then going to apply the tool to three different scenarios. um, and this will be looking at a range of different EV ownership and access to EV infrastructure, just to give a sense of how this tool can be used. And again, how states can start kind of having those conversations with policymakers, can start having, building that story around kind of how they need their needs and what they need to do in order to fund their transportation system. Um, and kind of this will all be packaged together in our final report. And I just wanted to touch on kind of the policy landscape piece that we're going to be including, and that will talk about some of the benefits and trade-offs of the different alternative revenue streams, because there's a reason why we've kept the fuel tax for so long, despite the issues that we're having with it. It is a very easy tax to administer, and so any additional option does have to take into account, like, what are your administrative costs, what is the potential public engagement efforts that are needed in order to educate the public on why this is necessary, and things along those lines. And again, we'll touch on kind of what is happening at the federal level in terms of trying to update some of our revenue sources as well. And so I guess, do we have any questions on this one?
I don't see anything in the chat. We did have one from Todd. He said he's wondering how Elon Musk's involvement in next administration will impact non-Tesla charging infrastructure. They already dominate here in Jersey.
Yes, that is a really good question, and I guess it's a little early to know how that might occur. But what I will say is that I think we already kind of saw that move towards kind of what I think they call the North American charging standard, which is the Tesla charging standard. We've seen, I want to say Ford and GM have already signed on to that, and so for American manufacturers, I think we're going to just see kind of a more of a move in that direction. So it will be interesting. I don't know what other kind of manufacturers are going to be doing to try and address that, because it has been kind of a big push from Tesla to kind of improve their experience. I think that's the thing, and this is why we talk about chicken and the egg a lot, about what comes first. And I think the access that you have to the Tesla charging network is a big benefit. And so having that, if you're driving, a Rivian or your Ford 150, the F-150 Lightning, is probably another big benefit as well. So I don't know, but I would think that that's kind of the way we're seeing it move.
And we did have another question from Yonggao Yang. He said, very interesting research. I'm wondering if you can share your slides with me. We are developing a scoreboard prototype system to assign a score to each state regarding transportation technology.
Yes, absolutely. I guess just My email will be on my next presentation, and feel free to email me, or I'll try and find your email, and I'll send you a copy of the slides. And we'll definitely be sharing the research once we wrap this up, hopefully here in December. So
Yes, and we are recording all the sessions, and we'll have them live on some platform after the event.
perfect.
And I think that might be all the questions. Let's give it just maybe another 10 seconds. I think that might be everything, Jackie, for the first presentation.
Okay, I'm just getting my other presentation ready. Okay, there we go. Okay. And so, yeah, you get to hear from me again, and again on the topic of EVs, but something slightly different this time. So, this project was looking again at funding and policy considerations for EVs, but what we called a life cycle based assessment. And so, I'll get into kind of the body of the research soon, but this research project has taken a few twists and turns that were not expected, which you'll realize by the end of this presentation. I did just want to give a quick shout out to the project team. It's kind of evolved a little bit over time, but this is our current team. We've had quite a few students help out with this, so it's been fantastic. Um, and so to kind of dive in, when we first kind of conceived of this research a few years ago, so it was 2022, right after the bipartisan infrastructure law and IIJA. And so what we were seeing essentially was an increase in EV sales in the US. And we expected that to continue, kind of some of the things I talked about in the last presentation. There was a lot of funding out there. And so all signs seem to point towards like a steady growth. And while things have kind of changed, things have leveled off, I do still think that especially in the light duty fleet, we're going to kind of continue to see incremental gains in electric vehicles. And so kind of on the flip side of that was this question about, well, EVs are typically heavier than their internal combustion engine counterparts. And so this kind of graphic shows you a little bit um, of kind of how that weight differential plays out, especially for some of our kind of light duty vehicles. Um, but the concern ultimately was, or what we were hearing a lot, especially in the media, was, well, what does that do to infrastructure wear and tear, especially pavement condition, but also a question on bridges. And so one of the things we really needed to dive into after kind of, struggling through some lack of literature concerns, which I'll talk about in a second, was okay. So we're hearing this concern about the weight of EVs, but what is that weight differential essentially? Kind of how much of a problem is this? How concerned should we be? Um, and so we have both light duty and heavy duty vehicles here and kind of what their weight difference is. And so if you're looking at the percentage difference, like depending on the vehicle, it can be quite, extreme. We see on the low end, the Tesla Model 3 really isn't that much heavier than your Toyota Camry. But when you're starting to look at some of the heavy duty ones, which is kind of understandable just due to the kind of weight of these trailers and what they're having to haul, it can be up to 45% more. And so is kind of like that was kind of like, oh, well, is that a concern? But realistically, especially kind of considering what we're seeing in terms of EV adoption on the light duty side, what we were really noticing is, well, we don't necessarily need to be concerned about light duty. And I'm no engineer, but from what I understand of kind of pavement condition and how we design our roadways, it's really all based around heavy duty vehicles. And so we did go into the research knowing that, but we were like, well, like we know that we're starting to see consumers, or we've seen over the past like few years, consumers really switching to, SUVs and light duty trucks. I'm like, what do they look like as EVs? But what I'm highlighting here on the slide is that even like one of the heavier kind of common trucks, so this Tesla Cybertruck, I think recently at least has been the most popular light duty truck option, and that's 6,000, just under 6,800 pounds. And it's really not getting to a weight that we'd be concerned about for pavement condition, because like typically we start to have that conversation around 10,000 pounds. And so people who know EVs may have heard about the Hummer EV, which was over 10,000 pounds. And while kind of I think a lot of the concern came from something like that, what I feel like we're seeing with the models now is that was kind of an anomaly. And realistically, they're all going to be kind of in this range. And while heavier than ICE vehicles, um, not necessarily enough to cause concern on the light duty side. And so, again, I kind of alluded to this, but realistically, this graphic is showing us that we focus so much of our roadway design standards on trucks. And so, what I want to kind of highlight is this jump from the 20% to 30% trucks. And you can see that, on a couple of the vehicles. So the VPDs, vehicles per day, on our roadways. And so obviously the higher this is, the more kind of impact you're having to pavement, essentially. And so we just know that it's so much driven by, it's very much driven by heavy duty trucks, essentially. And so that's really the concerned with. And so we kind of went in and started to look kind of at the literature. And realistically, there's just limited research out there right now. And again, this is kind of one of the things that we were hoping to, add to kind of like the academic body of knowledge. It's like we hear about this a lot kind of in the media, but what is like out there that's scholarly and peer reviewed? But again, I think some of the concerns is that pavement design standards really do focus on commercial vehicles, and so far that electric heavy-duty truck adoption has remained pretty low. And I think there is this continued expectation that batteries will decrease in weight. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I do think that that's kind of one of the things that's still unknown. I do think we're in such an early stage of this. It's too soon to be able to really decide on policy, but I do think there's a lot of policy questions that came from what we found. And so, as I mentioned, there was limited literature on this topic, but from what we did see, there was a report by UC Davis, and essentially they found that there was no discernible difference in expected pavement performance. There is a couple of caveats to this, and based on their assumptions in their modeling, but um, one of which is that market penetration is low, and obviously they're looking at the California um, like as a case study, and California is probably further ahead than most states in terms of heavy duty vehicles. So if they're saying market penetration is and kind of will continue to be low in the near term, I would expect that to be reflective of the rest of the country. We see them as being a little bit further out ahead. Um, they also had the note in there that, one of the key things is axle load regulations are really not expected to change. And so what we have seen is an increase in the gross vehicle weight. So there is an extra 2,000 pounds that is allowed over the 80,000 pound limit for zero emission vehicles. But because we're not changing the axle loading on that, again, it's kind of not really impacting pavement performance. And so on the graph I showed you earlier, we talk about pavement performance in terms of equivalent single axle loads. And so everything really is kind of how much is loaded on those axles. So when we don't change that policy, there isn't necessarily going to be, a noticeable increase in road damage because of that. And kind of just a few more points from that literature review. So what I will say is kind of they found that bridge studies kind of still remain inconclusive, that bridges that have a lower condition rating are going to be impacted by weight. And I do know that, the axle loading and spacing is more important when we're talking about bridge condition, but there's still just like not enough that we know about that yet to be making any policy decisions. Um, and then kind of something that we heard that was in this literature, but also we heard from experts, is that kind of environmental exposure is typically more responsible for damage on, residential streets than increased weight, especially because we don't necessarily see the heavy duty trucks on residential streets as often as well. But kind of more broadly, when we were talking to some folks, they basically said that while, yes, weight is a factor. And if we saw kind of a wholesale change over the next few years that rapidly increased, the adoption of EVs, maybe that would change things. But realistically, it'd be like 1 to 2 years in terms of like the life of the pavement. And again, that's kind of something that, environmental factors can also do the same thing. So like weather related damage can essentially do the same thing. And so Well, so we were kind of at this point, this is what we've heard from this is what we've read, and when in talking with some experts, this is what we've seen from the literature. But originally, this research was hoping to create a decision support tool for states, and so we're like, well, we need to talk to the state DOTs to see where they're at with this and how they're thinking about it. And I will say we're still in that stage right now, so we're still talking to state DOTs, but based on our kind of initial discussions with them, they're at most having kind of preliminary discussions on the topic. Um, what we've heard, especially from one state, is that they're really focused on expanding the light duty EV fleet. They see that as kind of the low hanging fruit, and that there's more challenges when we think of especially heavy duty trucks or some of the commercial trucking, because they can't use the same infrastructure, often charging infrastructure, as a light duty fleet. So maybe we would start to see in terms of like the medium duty fleet, and some of our kind of like delivery vans in the future, but those can, for the most part, use the same infrastructure. So again, there wasn't necessarily a concern about the weight and infrastructure, wear and tear. Um, and yeah, and so kind of the point that I keep making, especially kind of from the commercial side, adoption while growing does remain low. And so I think this is a question that state DOTs are not really grappling with yet. Um, and ultimately, I think we did hear that the trucking industry has started to question this, um, and from the place of it impacts their capacity to carry freight. And so if if their trailer weight is 5,000 pounds more than if they were using a conventional, an ICE vehicle, then that's 5,000 pounds they can't move, in a sense. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second too. But ultimately, it does become kind of a policy question on what do we want our tolerable weight limits to be, and kind of when do we need to start having those conversations as well. And so I think one thing that's been like a through line throughout everything we've seen is kind of our uncertainty around some of the timelines here. And so this is kind of what we see as the kind of key considerations from what we found. There is uncertainty over battery technology and what the improvement timeline is. There is still the expectation that it will improve, but we don't necessarily have a sense of when that will happen. But there is the assumption that it will be before we see kind of any higher levels of market penetration that would then kind of cause us concern for pavement wear and tear. And again, kind of that links to the adoption timelines, especially on the commercial side. We don't seem to have as good a grasp on how that transition is going to go. And part of that does kind of lead to questions about, does it make economic sense for the trucking industry, which I think is one of the things that kind of one of the questions that we have coming out of this research as well. And finally, policy. So we are hearing or seeing the trucking industry ask for increased weight tolerances, but we haven't necessarily seen any movement on that. And one thing I will say is that I don't think we would necessarily see movement from the state before we saw movement from the federal level. Because you don't want to put that extra environment, like extra damage onto your, local or state roads that maybe weren't necessarily designed to handle that traffic as well. And so some of the kind of research needs that I've been alluding to, and what we're hearing, especially from states and what we are seeing from our kind of literature review, is that we need kind of more and better data on trucking industry operations. So you hear a lot from the trucking industry about this being kind of a very big concern when we talk about the increased weight of these vehicles kind of cutting into their bottom line. And I think that does make a lot of sense. But how much of the trucking industry is this impacting? And is there a way that we can craft policy that essentially supports those industries that really need the extra weight, that need those allowances in terms of gross vehicle weight or axle loading, without just doing a wholesale, yeah, we're going to increase it, 5 to 10,000 pounds. And then, as I mentioned, kind of a better understanding of the battery technology improvement timeline, I think would help states with their planning. But again, it's kind of difficult to really nail down what that might be. And then finally, and this is something that again came up in the UC Davis paper, is electric is not the only option in terms of alternative fuel. And so I think what we see, especially from the commercial side of things, is a little bit more of a focus in terms of hydrogen. And so in that UC Davis paper at the kind of later end of their model in 2050, they were expecting a lot of trucks to be hydrogen powered rather than electric. And so kind of understanding what that makeup would be and kind of when we would likely see more hydrogen trucks, again, is a very important question. And I think there are things that we've heard kind of outside of a little bit outside of the scope of kind of what we were expecting. And so I've talked a little bit about those economic impacts to freight, kind of what is the bottom line for them and what are some of the policy options we can utilize to support that industry. But what we're also seeing and hearing is kind of safety concerns. And so that's both from the sense of vulnerable road users. We know that kind of weight affects, not just braking, but also then if a collision were to happen, it's far more likely to have an adverse impact if with a heavier vehicle. And so I think there's concerns on that piece, but also in terms of roadside safety devices. And I don't know whether everyone's seen the Tesla crash that our roadside safety folks did at TTI, but it does show that we don't necessarily have an understanding of how electric vehicles interact with some of that infrastructure, and that's something we've heard kind of from states as well as a concern. And I know we're kind of running out of time, so I'll wrap it up right here, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
So we do have a question in the Q&A box. It's from Melissa Tooley. She said, "Great presentation. Do you think that ultimately the economic and safety considerations will dampen the adoption of the EVs in the freight industry?"
I do think that kind of, especially in the near term, I think leads to hesitancy, especially because we don't necessarily have the charging infrastructure to support. So it's not just a consideration of you're maybe not able to move as much freight. It's also, well, you have to put in the charging infrastructure. And I know that some states are using kind of the charging and fueling infrastructure grants to try and do that. And so the idea there is kind of helping the trucking industry by proving that it can work, having the state do those demonstrations before expecting the industry to kind of start to invest. But I do think that we see a slight dampening because of that. I think that especially around port operations is what I've heard, because they tend to be the ones that are maybe carrying around that 80,000 pound limit, that there is kind of it's hurting our bottom line. We don't really want to switch. And so I think, that's something that I think we have to think about in terms of like, if this is where we want our vehicle fleet to go, what are the policy incentives that we maybe need to help that transition occur?
Thank you for the response. I am not seeing anything else in the chat or the Q&A. I know we're right at 10:44, so we're going to end the session here right on time. A lot of people are saying thank you to the presentation and giving you claps. I'm going to go ahead and do a formal round of applause for you, Jackie. Thank you so much. For being here with us today. Just for the flow, to go back to the general session, when we do go back to the general session room, we're going to take about a 10-minute break to allow for the other sessions to kind of formally come to an end. So if you just go back up to your event map, we are all going to reconvene in the general session room. So the title of the session is 2024 Insight Virtual Colloquium General Session. That is where we're going to head next. And again, we will be taking about a 10-minute break just to allow our other sessions to wrap up their conversations. So I'll see you guys back in the general session.